Hi, welcome to Something About Salem. I'm Jared Tedeschi. Today we're talking about pioneer perspectives and popular narratives surrounding pioneer stories and what's missing from those popular narratives. We started at the top of the state capitol. Take a look. On a clear Oregon day, at the top of the state capitol, we met up with Stacy Nalley.
It's not always this pretty up here.
A visitor services representative, for some fun facts about Salem's most iconic landmark and the pioneer's perspective from the eyes of the state. A lot of people asked me to ask if he's real gold and if he's solid gold or if he's hollow. So can you tell me a little bit about that?
Would that be amazing if he was solid gold? Yes, he is 18,000 pounds, but not of solid gold. He is hollowed bronze.
Gotcha, hollowed bronze.
He is covered in 23 karat gold leafing. It takes about 11.5 ounces of gold to leaf him.
Wow.
He's 23 feet tall. And I like to compare it, especially to children, to an Easter bunny.
Oh, I love it.
You know, the hollowed out chocolate with that gold wrapper.
Yeah.
That's exactly what our pioneer is.
There's some confusion, I think, about what the tallest building in Salem is. Can you tell me which of the buildings in Salem is the tallest?
You know, we are the tallest that you can walk out on.
Okay.
However, we are not the tallest point in the city. In fact, right over our shoulder, you can see the tallest point of the city. It's actually the spire of the church on State Street.
Wow.
By statute, we are at a level that nobody else is going to be able to build to. So that is a city rule. However, the spire of that church predates our building. It was built in the late 1800s. This building was built in 1938.
Okay.
So by the time that was set into place, of course, that's like a grandfather clause. So it will remain the tallest point in Capitol.
Just beneath our feet on Salem's highest observation deck is the Capitol Rotunda, where the imagery and narrative is centered on the pioneer's journey and the values of that travel.
So the Oregon State Capitol is a link to the past, to the present, and to the future.
Oh, I love that.
And the link to the past is really all around us here in the Capitol Rotunda. Starting with our state seal, there is, of course, reference to the past and the pioneers in our state seal. We have the pioneer wagon being pulled by oxen. And then the tools of the pioneer, and that also represent agriculture, which was very important to the history of our state. And then, of course, we have the mural up on the wall that is the artist's depiction of the Great Wagon Train Migration, otherwise known as the Oregon Trail. So that's coming across the Willamette Valley in 1843, of which we had 900 pioneers make that journey, 600 of which were children, and they did that all on foot, more than 2,000 miles.
Does anyone ever ask you about the Oregon Trail video game?
You know, we definitely get asked about the Oregon Trail video game, and in our store, we have some merchandise that has that pixelated, iconic wagon.
Yeah.
It actually makes reference to, you know, new industry in Oregon.
Right.
It says they came for the beer.
Oh, that's funny. I used to love that game, and now I guess I love the beer. For many school children, the Oregon Trail video game is played to contextualize settler narratives. Not all students can say that they have this access to the game's finish line.
This is what we do, you know, half the year. These school children coming up here.
My voices are off. I'm trained to listen and I can't hear.
Within the immediate gaze of Oregon's pioneer is another one of the tour's touchstones.
Walk of Flags, the nice thing about that is that it represents every state in the order it was admitted to the Union, and then it has our 9 tribal flags in the front. It is pretty.
The 9 native flags displayed here are representative of the 9 federally recognized native tribes. Though the Walk of Flags was dedicated in 2005, the native emblems were not included until 2009.
And then over here, let's just take a look at these. This is that up close of the gilding process. So you see the statue actually primed in the background, and those very thin leaves of 23 karat gold that is then adhered to him. And then this is actually the process of Ulrich Ellerhusen, who was the sculptor of the Pioneer, showing how he created him out of wood. This was done in New Jersey. And then when he was brought to the front of the Capitol, he was that hollowed 18,000-pound bronze statue. And it took 3 days with a rope and pulley system to have men pull him to the top of the Capitol. And we like to explain all of these components to children and guests so they realize exactly how he got to where he is now. So one of the things that we do here is allow children and guests to measure themselves up to the pioneer. This is the actual size of our pioneer's leg. From the bottom of his boot to the top of his boot, it's about 6 feet tall. So you can get right in there and you're gonna fit right in.
Yeah.
I think it would be some work for you to even look over that boot.
To look over the boot?
It's a chin up.
I could live in the boot.
That's right, you could live in the boot.
Like the little old lady that lives in the shoe, yeah? Not unlike the little old lady nursery rhyme, the statue has been criticized by some for the axe in his right hand, what could be read as a strong symbolic nod to violence. So can you tell me a little bit about what the gold man represents?
Absolutely. So our gold man, the actual name of him is the Oregon Pioneer, but a lot of people call him the gold man, so we always say AKA the gold man, because that's what children call him. He is a symbol of the pioneer spirit. How he embodies that spirit is by the pioneer's journey. He also has tools that were very important to the pioneers on him. He has a hatchet and a piece of canvas. A lot of people don't know that that's what's over his shoulder. And then the way he's placed on our building, he is faced to the north, but he is looking to the west. That embodies the Northwest spirit that brought the pioneers to Oregon. He is the artist's interpretation of what a pioneer would have looked like coming across the trail.
Thank you so much for all of that information.
You're
It was great to
welcome.
meet you today, Stacy.
Great to meet you.
Thank you so much. Now we'll be talking with Dr. David Lewis, who's with us here today. And Dr. Lewis is an anthropologist and researcher and ethnographer at Oregon State University. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Lewis.
Great to be here.
Yes, thank you so much. So what we see at the Capitol with the pioneer narratives is what we see in public schools. It's what we talk about with the pilgrims around Thanksgiving, and it's this idolization and romanticization of the pioneers and the pioneers' journey. So what are your thoughts on these popular narratives, and what are your thoughts on what they negate?
Well, first off, I mean, they obviously support a narrative of colonization of this part of the world, especially for the pioneer on top of the Capitol. It emphasizes really two things: this idea of settlement and the sort of pioneer spirit in a way, which has been sort of aggrandized on Oregon Trail narratives, which have been taught to kids for, I don't know, 100 years or so in schools, public schools. And it also, him being gold, it emphasizes this other history of Oregon, of the gold rush in Oregon. So there's this two parts of the story there. And what it negates really is the other side of that history of really invasion of native lands, the takeover of all this area, which is now called Oregon, and the destruction of the tribes. Treaties, forced resettlement of the peoples onto a reservation, and their complete removal from the land, the loss of all their sovereignty, the loss of their rights and everything else. And so that story is generally not taught in public schools, has not been taught, and is not represented at all in the Capitol. In fact, some of the murals and some of the statues in front suggest that the tribes actually helped with colonization. With Sacagawea being in the statuary, and some of the native people looking like they're working for the settlers on some panels and things. So that kind of reinforces another narrative, which is that natives helped with colonization.
Right. So And correct me if I'm wrong, but historically, Native tribes were forced to sign treaties that gave up the rights to their land. Is that correct?
That's the popular narrative. There is some nuances to that story. The tribes didn't. They were not forced to. There was no guns being pointed at them. However, they all knew that if they didn't sign treaties and sell their land and move to a reservation, they would all die. So it wasn't like they were being, like tied up and forced to sign a document. And many actually chose not to. There's some folks like the Cayuse and others that chose not to sign treaties and things, but most did, because they knew that if they didn't, that they would all basically be destroyed, and it would be like a massive extermination.
So the pioneers and what was talked about in the Capitol tour is it's highlighted that the pioneers are consider agriculture to be very important, and obviously the land that they were doing the agriculture on was not their land. So how do you think that colonial land care has contributed to the global environmental crisis?
That's a huge question. I mean, I think that the taking of all the tribal lands removed tribes from the land mostly, but the change of land management and land tenure altered sort of the native landscape away from a diverse landscape where many different types of animals and people and plants could live there, to a sort of monoculture. So right now, that was the pattern that was brought from, basically the East Coast and Europe to here, and for the tribes that were here, it destroyed their main food sources, because they were well known to be digging roots and camas and wapato and other things, and that the plowing of their fields destroyed that food source. And then the settlement by settlers hunted. They liked to hunt, so they hunted out all the game with rifles, which are much more efficient than bows and arrows, and so just for Oregon alone, that basically destroyed the food sources and destroyed the way of life for the tribes. So they had no food; they were starving essentially. And much of that food that was grown by the settlers was not grown to feed the settlers themselves. Much of it was shipped out to international ports. So that was really the first sort of globalization of food from Oregon, from settlement areas, frontier areas, to places. The wheat that was grown here, the flour that was made in Oregon City, was shipped out to places like San Francisco, to Asia, to other places. So it didn't stay here. So we were a net exporter of food, from the fur trade on, because Hudson's Bay Company had exporting of crops, because we had really good soils and everything else. And so you could extend that to colonization around the world, doing the same thing around the world, removing land from all these native peoples around the world, these indigenous peoples, and contributing pretty broadly to a pattern of monocropping, to lack of diversity, and to the environmental destruction we see today. Absolutely right.
So I know that some work that you've done personally has been around native name placing, which, if I understand it correctly, is a response to colonial erasure of native signifiers on the land. So what is the value and the power that you see in replacing the native names once more?
Replace, putting them back on the land. Yes. Yeah. Well, sometimes we try to put the original native name back, if we have that. A lot of native people didn't name everything like they do today.
Yeah.
So sometimes we have to make up names or make names based on, what the resources that were available there, or something like that. So, but yeah, for native people to see their native language expressed on the landscape around them as part of the landscape is kind of like a pride and identity issue of who they are. Because we all know that native people have been here for tens of thousands of years. And so all the original names of the places around us were original native names. They were, so part of colonization was renaming everything to sort of benefit the Europeans or the Americans. Even though, like Mount Hood, for example, was named after a Captain or Admiral Hood, who never really ever came to Oregon.
Right.
So we use that as a common name now in Oregon, and the guy never reached here. So so that is this aspect of colonization, and tribes would like to return the names of the land because they actually disappeared much longer than Americans have been here or British have been here. Our names have been here for 10,000 years or more. So there's a much deeper history there.
And what does it mean to have the native language and the native names attached to these products of colonization?
It's a point of pride. I mean, I would rather, have the places around me as a native person sort of exemplify my culture, who I am, so that I feel like I'm in my native land again.
Like something has been done justice.
Right. So we were reversing some of the colonization. So it's really a decolonization thing.
Right.
We're reversing some of the colonized aspects of American European settlement here, and returning and sort of decolonizing the area.
So you bring up decolonization and relabeling spaces as an active way to enact decolonization. What are other ways that in everyday life we can look towards decolonization and enact it into our everyday culture?
Well, I think it's really important that all people, all Oregonians or all people, wherever they're at, need to learn the full history of their place. Because a lot of times U.S. history has been taught to us, and we only get, the history of essentially white male Americans or Europeans, whatever. And so that discounts the fact that there were women here, other minority groups, and Native peoples here for tens of thousands of years. And so I would rather that be a part of our history. I think everybody would like to hear the whole history, not literally a quarter of the history when they're taught history. And that, I think, would help us all sort of understand more about each other. We have a lot of problems in our world today. Many of these problems are a lack of understanding of other cultures, of other peoples, of other ways of thinking, of other ways of being in the world. And so maybe if we all kind of understood more about each other, we'd all get along better.
You referenced what you said, the pioneer spirit, which is referenced in the Capitol tour as a kind of a point of pride of what the Gold Man represents. He represents the pioneer spirit. We also noticed that he is holding an axe in his right hand, which I just think is interesting to point out. But what do you interpret as the pioneer spirit in regards to how the Capitol kind of views it as a point of pride?
The pioneer spirit to me is basically manifest destiny. This idea that you can take whatever you want to from Native people. They don't matter because they're savages or whatever. And so they are less than people in many ways that if you read through the narratives of the time period, they were not even considered worthwhile as people, as humans. And so they were talked about as being almost like wolves, subject to extermination. And so, and that's what really would happen. And so that sort of pioneer spirit is really kind of, when you really think, delve down into it, it's like white privilege. The privilege to basically have whatever you want to, take whatever land you want to, take whatever rights you want to, and destroy minority peoples all you want to.
So you're saying the pioneer spirit is, it represents entitlement.
Entitlement, privilege, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, they're entitled to do that because they're Christians, they're white Americans,
Right.
Absolutely.
So what comparisons do you see between historical colonization and what we see in the present day happening all over the country with gentrification?
Well, I saw this happening in 2008 when we saw this huge housing crisis. And banks were basically making tons of cash off people that were sort of underwater in their houses, and I noticed that it was almost the same thing. I mean, the banks were basically repossessing all these houses, and the average people, your average Americans, didn't have any kind of rights at all, and nobody was helping them out. There was no bailout for average Americans, and so in a sense, what's happening today is there's a whole corporate sort of like system that feeds on the power of average Americans, and the bottom of that, of that totem pole, if you want to, if I can use this expression like that, would be all minorities and non-white people who basically have no rights. We don't have access to the same parts of society that white people have. Don't have the privilege. Are not born with the privilege. We don't have. We just don't have the same rights as white Americans.
Right, and that's represented essentially in white privileged Americans going into the neighborhoods that might be cheaper to live in, or and
absolutely right. So in terms of like what you were saying about gentrification, absolutely, they have all the power. They have all the money. They're part of that 1% perhaps, because there's more white Americans that are 1%ers than anything else. They're able to buy up these sort of poor, depressed neighborhoods and re-envision them in a way they make more money.
Right.
And so that's gentrification.
Right.
And they force out, in a sense, all those minorities and other people, the poor, the minorities, the other people that can't afford to live there any further.
Right. So that also embodies the pioneer spirit that we just discussed.
Absolutely. It's kind of like its own, kind of a new way of dispossessing people, and just for the rich.
Right. So what do you think needs to change the most going forward, like we talked about with how the public narratives in schools and in institutions like the Capitol that constantly reinforce these false or diluted stories? What do we need to do to do justice to the history through accuracy?
I think that part of our biggest problem right now is the school systems. Right now, all school systems in the United States are forced to accept a curriculum that is basically based on the STEM program: science, technology, engineering, mathematics, or they don't get federal funding for school. And so that has disempowered or dissociated social sciences, social studies, from part of what we are educating people. And so so we're having several generations of people now that are not learning history. They don't know anything about cultural studies. They don't care because they want to get a job in one of those 4 areas, and that is going to cause a lot of strife. It is causing a lot of strife. There's a lot of people basically that don't know anything about where they live, about what's happened before them, and so that's a big problem. And I think that we need to sponsor efforts to get away from the STEM program, to get back to a full, wholesome, holistic education for everybody, less testing and more educating. And I think that, and then people need to be naturally curious and naturally critical about things around them. Just because you're told one thing on Facebook does not mean it's true. People need to adopt a sort of more critical, more curious attitude towards the world around them. In a very real sense, there's people out there that are almost like sheep that don't even think about, critically about the world around them, that the things they're being told are perhaps being told them to manipulate them and to believe in a certain way. And so I think that whatever we can do to sponsor or promote more curiosity on the part of everybody towards other people, towards the world around them, towards social sciences, towards history, the better.
Thank you so much for sharing that perspective with us today.
Yeah.
I really appreciate your time and having you join us and sharing it with all of the viewers who are watching. Thank you so much, Dr. David Lewis.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was great to meet you and great to have you today.
Great. Thank you.
That's all that we have time for today. Thank you again to Dr. David Lewis, and I hope you learned something about Salem. I know I did. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.